There are 6 bills moving through the U.S. Congress, all of which attempt on some level to break up big tech companies. We're talking about Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Twitter. The question is, how far will these bills go? And is big tech even worried about them? Well, worried enough that the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, personally called Nancy Pelosi to try to stop these bills from moving forward. Our guest today says that even if 1/5 of what's in these bills makes it through, it would dramatically change big tech.
The Federal Trade Commission, the main commission in the USA that's going to enforce these laws, just got a new chairwoman, Lina Khan, who's one of the foremost experts on antitrust, who was part of the House Antitrust Subcommittee work. She's an incredibly fierce enforcer. She's going to be the one who's going to enforce these laws. She did all the groundwork to make sure that these laws could be well informed and hopefully will pass.
I'm Ben Swan, and this is Truth in Media. Hey guys, welcome to the show. A lot to get to today. Today we're going to be speaking with the founder of Basecamp, David Heinemeier Hansson, who will be speaking to us about these 6 bills that are moving through Congress right now, each of which is attempting to break up big tech on some level. Do these bills even have a chance? We're going to be talking about all that. But before we get to it, a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, Create Tailwind and CreateTailwind.com. If you are ready to take control of your financial future, and if you're worried about the rapidly rising inflation in this country, you've got to talk to Bob Burnett and Jim Oliver over at Create Tailwind. They can teach you the Austrian economic principle of infinite banking, how to bank on yourself. And they can also teach you all about the crypto industry and how to get involved in that. Talk to them today, CreateTailwind.com. All right, so a couple of weeks ago, I had the chance to interview David Heinemeier Hansson. He's the founder of Basecamp, and he was talking to me about this idea of the big tech companies and what's happening with them. As you may know, there are a number of bills that are moving through Congress right now in an attempt to break up big tech on some level. Now, we should mention that when we talk about breaking up big tech, obviously one bill can't do that because Amazon is a vastly different company than Facebook, that is a vastly different company than Google, that is a vastly different company than Apple. In order to be able to rein these companies in, you have to create a kind of a series, a patchwork of bills that would be able to deal with antitrust on a number of levels, from advertising and the way that these companies deal with advertising, to the way they deal with customer data, the way they deal with portability of data, to the way they deal with shutting down free speech. All of those things have to be dealt with on some issue because, as you probably know, antitrust is a very big deal. The elimination of competition, the blocking of competitors in this space has been going on for a long time. The question is, do these bills even have a shot?
But these 6 bills focus on a number of remedies to deal with the fact that these platforms simply have too much power to be able to set all the rules by themselves, just like, as you mentioned, in the beginning of the 20th century and all the oil is flowing through Standard Oil in the US, or when the railroads were monopolies, or when the telecoms were monopolies. These are actually the same issues. So when we talk about whether antitrust laws are outdated or not, I don't think that's the right question. It is the fact that the enforcement in the U.S. have been incredibly lax, in part because a doctrine was established in the 70s and 80s called the Consumer Welfare Standard, which essentially reduced all questions of monopoly power down to, are prices going up? Do consumers have to pay more for the same products? And if not, well, then there's no monopoly abuses. Obviously, that is not the total sum of monopoly power. Monopoly power is used as a competitive cuddle to prevent other competitors from coming along, regardless of whether consumer prices are being raised or not. Monopoly power, in fact, determines the influence on democracies, as we've seen here with Tim Cook reaching out directly to Pelosi to try to squash these bills. I've testified in front of several state houses that had other bills to constrain monopoly power. And again, we saw this same thing. These companies have so much power and so much money that they can essentially buy every single lobbyist in a state to show up and intimidate lawmakers against holding them accountable to these monopoly statutes. So we have a real issue where there is simply vastly too much power in the hands of far too few companies, and we have to do something about it. And these bills make a huge step forward. If we even get a fifth of what's in these bills, it's going to be a revolution for how these platforms are being governed and pursued.
Well, we mentioned here in the lead up that these different bills obviously address different issues, right? It's not a one size fits all solution, which I think is appropriate. That makes sense. There are, when you talk about Facebook and you talk about Google and talk about Amazon, these are very different companies. So the remedy to the amount of power they have or influence that they might have has to be dealt with differently. In Google's case, as you probably well know, they're facing over and over these antitrust fines. It's not just investigations, but fines in Europe. France just issued an enormous, I think, a record fine against Google recently for its ad policies and the way that it's harming essentially competing advertisers. We see this happening over and over, and fines have proven to not be the remedy. I think any person who looks at what's happened in Europe would recognize that these companies are just building into their bottom line the cost of doing business as part of that, breaking the rules and getting fined. And at some point, you have to say, we've got to move beyond fines, don't we? And move to something that actually has real enforcement to it.
Yes, the fines as they have been handed out so far are a complete joke. When regulators celebrate themselves because they smack on a $1 billion fine or a $5 billion fine, that is a week's worth of revenue for these companies. It just does not matter at all. In fact, it simply puts a price on the abuse, which encourages further abuse because now you have a standard set up. How much does it cost to essentially squash competitors? How much does it cost to abuse your monopoly power? Clearly, that cost is far less than the spoils of doing so. Ergo, let's continue doing so. That's what's different about these bills. These bills about behavioral remedies, not saying, "Oh, you did something bad in the past. Here's a fine. That's small and insignificant. Are we all square now?" No, we're not. These bills are behavioral remedies that put guidelines and guardrails in place and saying you simply cannot do this. And if you do, we're not going to slap you with a $1 billion fine or $5 billion fine. We're going to slap you with a continued fine of 15% of your worldwide revenues. If you look at someone like Apple, for example, that might be $15 billion a year. Okay, now you're talking, right? Now the price of breaking these laws is going to be far in excess of the benefit you get out of it, and that's actually going to matter. But it's, again, about getting behavioral remedies on the books. You cannot do this. You cannot use tying. You can't say developers who publish applications on the app stores also have to use your exorbitantly priced payment processing system. These things are divorced. One of the other bills talks about the fact that if you own the marketplace, like Amazon.com, you cannot also sell your own products on that marketplace. That's a very severe behavioral remedy. I think it's a great one. It would completely upend how things work with these tech companies if they can't both own the platforms and advantage themselves on those platforms. And this is where we're going to see the real change. The unfortunate fact, I'm from Denmark myself. I've been cheering on the European Union for a long time of what they've been trying to do here, but they're stuck in the past when they think a $1 billion fine or even a $5 billion fine is going to do anything at all. And I think we're finally coming to that realization on a worldwide basis that that old school of enforcement is simply dead. It does not matter. It does not produce the kinds of changes we need to see. So now it's time for a new tack.
Well, and I think there has to be at some point a differentiation made. If you want to be a platform, if you want to be Apple and create platforms and you want to create app stores, then create your platform and app stores. The problem is when you see a company like Apple, for instance, in my opinion, also now wants to become the competitor to Spotify, right? So there's a lawsuit that Spotify, as you know, has been filed against Apple saying, look, the way that we're treated on your platform, the cost of us doing business on your platform is unfair because you are essentially passing costs to us that we're forced to pass on to our users, and you're cutting yourself a different kind of a deal. You're making it better for yourself. You mentioned Amazon. We talked about that at the top of the show, where Amazon will take data from specific merchants on their marketplaces, create competing products based upon the data and the demographics and the price points that entrepreneurs had to work hard and sacrifice in order to figure all these things out in their process. Amazon just steals that information because it's on their platform and builds a competing product and undercuts them. The idea that this hasn't been dealt with yet, to me, that alone is scandalous. I know that some of the Republican lawmakers who have complained about this, Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, is making statements about how, well, these antitrust bills, they put too much power in the hands of the antitrust regulators, as opposed to who? As opposed to the power that's in the hands of Google and Apple right now. I don't think this is a left versus right issue. This is really more of a power versus the people issue. And when certain entities become too powerful, there has to be a method for intervention. I gave you the last word here.
Absolutely. And that's what's so encouraging to see about this whole set of bills. This is not just a partisan effort solely with the Democrats on the one side pushing against Republicans on the other side. Every single one of the bills that's just been presented to Congress have Republican co-signers on it. In my opinion, the most important of these bills is the American Choice and Innovation Online Act, which addresses exactly the point you just talked about, that platforms like Amazon.com can't just steal the data of the vendors that are using their platforms to create competing products that they then advantage on their own platform to drive those innovators out of business. That is literally one of the points in the bill that gets outlawed. And that bill is co-sponsored by Republican Ken Buck and Lance Gooden, alongside David Cicilline, the chairman, and Jerry Nadler on the Democratic side. And that is the same for all the other bills. So you have a bipartisan effort here. Republicans are realizing, just as Democrats have, that this is not tenable. We can't hand over the entire economy to 5 big tech companies. That doesn't work. It doesn't work for democratic accountability. It doesn't work for innovation. It doesn't work for America. It doesn't work for the world. So we have to do something. And I'll be honest and say, when I testified in front of this House Antitrust Subcommittee in January of last year, I thought, you know what? I don't think a lot's going to happen. Nothing has happened in the past 15 years that I've observed these platforms getting more and more powerful. But I was wrong. This is a huge step forward. These bills include incredibly dramatic behavioral sanctions that, again, if even just a fifth of it passes, we're going to be living in an entirely new world after this is over.
Let me ask you before you go, though, how many of these bills do you think will actually become law? How many do you think will actually get out? And which ones, if any, get stopped? Which ones do you think will be stopped?
Well, I think the Ending Platform Monopolies Act, which is the one that essentially says if you own a platform, you can't participate in it at all. So Amazon.com wouldn't be able to have any of its own product lines on there. That is a quite radical bill, although one that's been advanced by Elizabeth Warren during her presidential campaign. So it could happen, but I could see that that is perhaps one of the bills that's going to face the stiffest opposition. The same with the Platform Competition and Opportunity Act, which essentially bans all forms of acquisitions by big tech. I think, again, sensible, but quite dramatic act. I am putting the bulk of my faith in the American Choice and Innovation Online Act, which includes all these behavioral remedies to constrain the power of these big tech platforms without essentially saying we have to shut them down and we have to split them up. I'm not sure that's going to work. I think these behavioral remedies that is simply establish what is lawful and what's not is what's going to make the difference, is what's going to find resonance on both sides of the aisle and what can be passed. And even so, if this passes, we're in a brand new world afterwards, an incredibly exciting move for an antitrust world that essentially has laid dormant for the past 15 years and allowed these platforms to accumulate this vast, vast amount of power.